All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. First, want to welcome you to this joint event sponsored between the Mansueto Institute and the Crown School. Really pleased to be able to do this event together. And especially pleased to have our speaker, who was selected by the Crown School, is Lance Freeman. And Lance is the James W. Efron University Professor of City and Regional Planning and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. And neighborhoods are really what fascinate him and motivate his research. He studies how neighborhoods change and evolve over time and the role neighborhoods play in people's lives. Some of his other recent work is exploring how we can use social media and other new kinds of technologies as tools to study neighborhoods. And his study of neighborhoods is motivated fundamentally by his interest in learning how to plan and build better and more equitable places. And this is one of the things he'll be talking with us about today. And so, Lance, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. And thanks for inviting me. Really excited to have the opportunity to come share some work that I've been doing. It's always, I find it flattering that people want me to come and talk to them about work that I've been engaging in. So hopefully I won't disappoint. This project grows out of work one of my former doctoral students was engaged in, looking at the politics of inclusionary zoning in New York City and in Paris, in France, a comparative study. And I suggested that beyond her dissertation, we actually look at some of the outcomes associated with that. Today, I'm only going to be talking about the New York City component of that larger project, but it is part of a sort of a comparative study comparing inclusionary zoning in New York City and in Paris. So question I'm interested in is, how does inclusionary zoning impact neighborhoods, and particularly the housing markets? As Chris said, I'm interested in neighborhoods, how they change over time, and how people are impacted. Inclusionary zoning, although I don't think I initially thought of it when learning about it in graduate school, for example, as something that triggers significant neighborhood change, over time, it's come to be perceived by many people as a potential agent of significant neighborhood change. And it has created a number of political challenges around its implementation. And so that's also part of what motivated the study. We have the political reactions to inclusionary zoning that challenges efforts to implement inclusionary zoning at a time when affordable housing is in desperately short supply. Understanding how inclusionary zoning does or doesn't impact communities is something I found very interesting. Okay, so I guess I'm blocking the screen a little bit. Inclusionary zoning, just in terms of a background, those of you not familiar with the practice, came of age in the late 20th century. This is at a time when many, white flight was at its peak. The urban crisis, if you will, was a period when cities were hemorrhaging populations. And so inclusionary zoning was perhaps initially thought of as a way to make the suburbs more inclusive, right? So some of the first inclusionary zoning was adopted in suburban communities, such as in Massachusetts or Montgomery County, New Jersey, and just as an example. More recently, several cities, including New York City, started applying inclusionary zoning to development within the center city. Now, inclusionary zoning, in places like New York, later Chicago, and several other cities, it's being viewed not only as a way to make the suburbs or affluent neighborhoods more inclusive, but as a tool to build affordable housing, right? So over its lifespan, inclusionary zoning has morphed somewhat from being seen primarily as a tool to integrate the suburbs and allow poorer households access to the suburbs, to more affluent communities, to one that produces affordable housing. And part of the attraction of inclusionary zoning is the potential to produce affordable housing without significant government subsidies. So in theory, the way zoning is supposed to work, the community or citizens or the government comes together, establishes a zoning code that meets the public interest of the community. And including in that usually is some type of density or certain restrictions on what can be built. And so with inclusionary zoning, what the community is saying to the developer, we're allowing you, or we're willing to allow you to deviate from the standards that we came together and adopted. And in exchange, we would like you to produce some affordable housing, right? From the developer's perspective, the increased density should, or ideally, will increase the profits that the developer earns. And some of those profits can be used to defray the cost of affordable housing. So in an ideal scenario, it's almost a win-win. The community is exchanging increased density or increased crowding or what have you for affordable housing. The developer is getting more profits and they're building affordable housing. So in theory, it's a win-win scenario. Nothing could ever be that simple though. Inclusionary zoning, which might seem to be a perfect antidote for affordable housing problems, it's also come under criticism. Some on the left, if you want to frame it politically, are skeptical of inclusionary zoning because it's seen as something that is a giveaway to developers. And this is particularly in the context now of inclusionary zoning in central cities, right? So this is not necessarily the case with inclusionary zoning in suburban communities under its original permutations when it was designed to help encourage integration. But now that inclusionary zoning is becoming more common in central city neighborhoods, central city communities, it is coming under some criticism for not doing enough, not producing enough affordable housing, being another way of boosting the profits of developers who already are rich, or so the argument would be. And on the other side, the argument could be made that by requiring affordable housing or introducing these additional regulations, developers will be deterred from building any housing, okay? Now, of course, a lot of this hinges on how strict the affordability requirements are. Is it voluntary? Can the developer opt into the program or not? Do they have that choice? So a lot of it depends on how the program is formulated. Of course, if the requirements are fairly onerous, if the developer has fewer options to opt in, they have to participate in the program, that runs the risk of indeed deterring any development and not achieving anything. On the other hand, you have this criticism that not enough is being done. And I'll talk more about this sort of conundrum later on in my talk, but this is where some of the criticisms are originating from. In New York City, the former mayor, Bill de Blasio, picked up on, he was a city council person before he became mayor. He picked up on these criticisms of New York City's inclusionary zoning program, which initially adopted in 1988, was voluntary. And it applied primarily to upper income neighborhoods, say the Upper East Side of Manhattan, those of you familiar with New York City geography. And his promise was that he would take this voluntary inclusionary program and build on that, expand it to other neighborhoods, but make it mandatory, right? So now any development that would occur would have to include affordable housing. As part of that requirement, the neighborhoods will also rezone, right? So the entire neighborhood was rezoned. Development could now happen at a higher density, but it had to include affordable housing, right? So that was a part of his campaigning, right? At the time, and certainly I think you would say after the mayoralties of Rudolph Giuliani and Bloomberg, yeah, he was seen as fairly progressive, and this was part of his progressive campaign. So New York City under the mayor adopts mandatory inclusionary housing. Several neighborhoods were upzoned, meaning that the allowable densities were increased, and the requirement was put in place that affordable housing had to be included in new developments. For the most part, and these neighborhoods were selected by the city's Department of City Planning, for the most part, they targeted working class neighborhoods. And that's primarily because of the economics, right? So rich neighborhoods like the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the land is simply too expensive to allow developers to earn a profit and produce affordable housing under the more stringent requirements. Gentrifying neighborhoods also, profit margins are too thin. And at the other extreme, the poorest neighborhoods would simply not be able to support market rate development that would carry the development. So it's kind of these neighborhoods just sort of a step up, if you will, from the poorest neighborhoods that are targeted. And that also, I think, contributes to some of the controversy that I'll talk about in a moment. It's also the case that developers can apply for the mandatory inclusionary housing outside of these zones, right? So that could just be for someone wants to build a building, say in a part of Queens, for example, and they want to build it at a higher density than the allowable zoning that's in place. They could apply. If it's approved, though, it would likely entail including affordable housing units. But today I'm going to be focusing on the neighborhoods that were rezoned. So these are neighborhood level rezonings. Okay, so this map, this kind of highlights where the rezonings occurred. These red parcels or polygons represent the neighborhood level rezonings. These blue ones, these are just small developer-led rezonings where the developer might apply for, they want to build a building, but they want to build it at a higher density. So if you're not familiar with New York City geography, but it's generally Upper Manhattan, which tends to be the lower income part of Manhattan, parts of the South and West Bronx, parts of East Brooklyn that have not experienced gentrification yet, Far Rockaway, and parts of Northeastern Staten Island. So those are parts of the city that, they're in the lower income. They haven't really experienced that much gentrification yet relative to other parts of the city. Okay, so this chart, and I know this is a lot to take in, but generally what it shows is that the developers have the choice between providing a larger area of affordable housing, but being able to target somewhat higher income households, or generally speaking, less affordable units, but then they have to provide a deeper subsidy. Okay, so there were several options that the developer could choose in terms of meeting the mandatory inclusionary housing requirements. What became controversial, one thing I would like to emphasize is that, for those of you not familiar, in deciding what is affordable housing, most localities depend on the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which surveys a metropolitan area and determines what the median income is for that metropolitan area. And then based on that, they set affordability levels. So, excuse me, in a city like Chicago, it would include the city of Chicago and its surrounding suburban communities, which quite likely have higher incomes than the city itself. And so what that does is when the affordability thresholds are set, they're based on the entire metropolitan area, including the more higher income suburban neighborhoods. And that tends to push up the affordability thresholds. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on when I talk about the implications of our findings. But just keep in mind that the affordability guidelines are based on the entire metropolitan area of New York City, not just the specific neighborhoods where the mandatory inclusionary housing was adopted. Okay, so although mandatory inclusionary housing was conceived of as a progressive initiative, quite quickly it came to be viewed as something that would be a giveaway to developers, as something that might wouldn't benefit the residents of these neighborhoods. And so, you know, perhaps counterintuitively or surprisingly, there was a lot of pushback against the adoption of mandatory inclusionary housing in the communities where it was being implemented. So, you know, the mayor ran on a campaign of being progressive, being in favor of redistribution, this being a key component of that platform, and yet it was received relatively coolly. The first iteration of the proposal was strengthened over time. This quote just highlights that. But nonetheless, there was still significant resistance or significant skepticism about the program. There was a fear that any new development in these neighborhoods would send a signal to people that this is the next, you know, next Williamsburg, the next up and coming neighborhood. And so perhaps counterintuitively, you know, the idea that building more housing would worsen the housing affordability crisis really took root in many of these communities. And so I just have here a few quotes where people talk about why they're skeptical of the mandatory inclusionary housing program. And, you know, people organized and protested his plan. It was seen as a luxury housing plan, something that would trigger gentrification, something that would benefit the developers, something that would not benefit people in the community. Part of this, though, again, is returning to the point I was making about the area median incomes and how affordability requirements were being set. So part of it is deriving from that. And in many instances, it is true that in these neighborhoods, although the housing is including affordable units, most of the people in that neighborhood can't afford it. And so part of it, you know, part of their complaints are not unfounded because they feel like, you know, this is not being built for us, so we can't afford it, even though the units are called affordable and it's part of the mandatory inclusionary housing program. So it was really the neighborhood rezoning where this became a problem because the single building rezonings don't trigger the same, you know, for probably intuitive reasons, don't trigger the same level of attention that rezoning an entire neighborhood did. So does this pushback make sense? What would we expect to happen as a result of a mandatory inclusionary program if new development is indeed built? Okay, so there is a signal effect. This is what the critics and opponents of mandatory inclusionary housing were putting forth. And, they were fairly persuasive in their arguments. In New York City, proposals such as rezonings have to go through an approval process, and each of the 59 community boards vote on these proposals. Only 10 of the 59 community boards voted in favor of it. Now, the community board votes are not binding, they're just advisory. Nevertheless, it does illustrate the extent to which this sentiment did take hold. On the other hand, and probably when the idea was initially being conceived, one might expect, well, if we build more housing, that's increasing the supply. So that should help lower prices, right? That's straight out of the Microeconomics 101 textbook. So that's another expectation. And then, the argument also made by economists could be that the additional regulation, if it is too onerous, might actually discourage housing, and you could end up with less housing, relatively speaking, than if you did not adopt mandatory inclusionary housing. So you could imagine several different possible outcomes that could happen. Most of the people, at least the vocal opponents, weren't really in this camp so much, although, certainly the real estate industry, generally speaking, was opposed to mandatory inclusionary housing, but it seems like the most vocal opponents were those who were skeptical because of the idea of a signal being sent that would trigger gentrification. So you have several hypotheses that could arise from these criticisms. One, does the mandatory inclusionary housing incentivize new development or discourage new development? What happens, right? Do we see more residential construction? So we collected data on permits for residential construction to get a sense of what were the patterns there. And then we were also interested in the cost of housing, which could provide some evidence of either increasing the supply, which could lower prices, or evidence of a signal of an up and coming neighborhood. And so we used two measures. One, we didn't have direct data on rents, but we are able to collect data of rental incomes that the city of New York collects for the purposes of property taxes. So if you own a rental building in New York City, the city will estimate your rental income and use that to levy your property taxes. And then we also use price data. So we do have price data, which, any sales transaction is recorded by the city. This is where we got the data from, New York City Open Data. They provide data, they have data on building permits and arm's length transactions. The rental income, we had to scrape from the city's website using Python. And so with this data, we have information about building permits, sales transactions, and rental income. Okay. This is a map. This is similar to the map I showed you earlier. What we did, we wanted to compare what was happening in the rezoned areas, which is the red areas, with the immediately surrounding areas. We have a buffer that's 1/10 of a mile and another buffer that is 1/4 of a mile, right? So the green and blue zones serve as our control areas, if you will. And so we're going to compare what happens in these red zones to what happens in the green and the blue zones. Reason why we have these two buffer zones is if there's any sort of spillover from the red area, we would presumably pick it up in the green buffer zone, the 1/10 of a mile buffer zone. So the green and the blue zones are not subject to the mandatory inclusionary housing requirements, but maybe for whatever reason, the effects or the perception spill over, maybe that would be picked up in the green buffer area. Okay, so we want to try to see what's going to happen when the MIH is adopted. And we have a pre-MIH area and a post-MIH area. The biggest challenge is, although these are adjacent areas, they're different, right? And so we run into the problem of, possibly omitting some important differences. We try to use a version of difference in differences where we'll look at the patterns, what's happening before and what's happening after, and also control for the trend that's happening. So, we're trying to see what's happening before and after, control for the trend, and see any changes that happen. Do they appear to be contemporaneous with the adoption of the mandatory inclusionary housing, and in a way that's consistent with one of the hypotheses that I listed in a previous slide. Okay, so try to illustrate this with an equation might not be, looking at it now might not be the best approach, but what we do specifically, and using permits as an example, what we attempt to do, we have a variable that measures if the property or if the area is within the zone or the buffer. We have another variable that measures the period before MIH adoption and afterwards. And we have another variable that measures the trend. Okay. So we can see, are permits greater within the zones or not? Are they greater before or after? And what's the overall trend in terms of permitting? But finally, we can also see an interaction, right? So do we see permitting changing in the MIH zone after the adoption of MIH, right? And does it change in a way that's different than what's happening in the buffer zones? We can also see an interaction between the MIH zone and a trend. And so in other words, is the trend different in the MIH zone compared to the buffer zones? And we can also look at the before and after period and the trend. So does the trend change after the adoption of mandatory inclusionary housing? And then finally, we have a three-way interaction, which allows us to see if the trend is different in the MIH area versus the buffer zones, and if that difference changes after the adoption of the MIH. And I'm going to ask you to repeat that back to me during the question and answer. So that's what we attempt to do. I have some figures that hopefully illustrate the point, illustrate our approach a little bit more clearly. A couple of caveats to keep in mind. So New York City has rent regulation. However, we still think even with rent regulation, at least until June 2019, there were ways that the landlord could increase the rent. So these are some of the loopholes, if you will, that would allow the landlord to raise the rent. And so even in a rent-regulated market, if pressures were occurring that were sending a signal or increasing or restricting the supply, or I guess restricting the supply, we still might observe rents being raised because there were several loopholes, at least up until June 2019. Unfortunately, our data stops in January 2020. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments, but we still think that despite rent regulation, we still might observe an impact on rentals.
Sorry, Lance, just a clarifying question. The change in the MIH zoning was in 2018. I just want to see if I got the timing right.
So it was initially adopted in 2016, and it rolled out in several neighborhoods over the ensuing periods. So it's an ongoing program, right? So we capture sort of a snapshot, if you will, or a certain time period from 2016 to 2020.
So the before and after indicator from the prior.
Okay, so yeah, we have data.
Different neighborhood.
Yeah, and we also have data going back several years before 2016 as well. And of course, COVID-19 occurs. We stop in January 2020. We did have some consideration about continuing on, but the disruption of the housing market, I think, would make our interpretation of the trends challenging, at least for several more years. Okay, so we have this sort of really once in a lifetime event that really would make extending the analyses for a year or two very difficult, I think, to interpret. So we stop in January 2020. Maybe we might pick it up, but that's for another day. Okay. So descriptive results, what's happening here. So now we have the red lines are the MIH zones, and these are the blue and the green are the respective buffer zones. The gold vertical line shows when MIH is adopted, and this is the x-axis represents time, so you can see what's happening. Generally, there's an increase in terms of permitting. These are just descriptive though, so I'm not going to attach too much weight to them, but here again, you see these are prices, generally upward sloping. What you do see though is that except for maybe the case of rents, the trends are not parallel. So that's why we include a trend measure, right, to try to control to that to some extent. One of the assumptions using differences is that the groups have a parallel trend before the intervention. That's not really the case here, maybe here to some extent, but we include a variable that measures the overall trend to try to limit that effect. All right, so what the results, generally speaking, there's some evidence that the permitting accelerates. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail. We don't really pick up, or we can't detect an impact on the prices and rents, which you could interpret as meaning didn't have an impact. As I said during the description of the hypotheses, we have some countervailing possible effects, but I think more likely, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, is that it just wasn't any effect. I think that's the more likely explanation. Okay, so these are, after adjusting for the regressions, including control variables, we have for sales, we have data on the characteristics of the buildings, we have spatial fixed effects as well. And so, including the controls, you can see here the pattern does suggest maybe that there's an increase in the permitting, but it's not statistically significant. When we test the slope, the change in the slopes, our estimates are not that precise. Yes.
Just curious in terms of statistical power, how much permitting, how many neighborhoods we're talking about?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So we have, in terms of permitting, there were 7 neighborhood rezonings, okay? We have 7 years of data, right? So we have, and then we have the 3 zones, right? So for permitting, and I should have jotted down the numbers. For permitting, we have probably about 500 or so observations. For rents and sales, we have several thousand observations. So, yeah, we have a fair amount of statistical power, I would say.
Sorry, and the unit of observation is a block or it's the entire zone?
So for sales, it's a property. For rentals, it's a property, it's a building. For permitting, we're looking at a zone. Because a permit, so within a certain geographic area, how many permits were issued? Other questions? But I'm gonna run out of time before I get to people's questions. So maybe I should take questions as I go along. Yes.
I was just wondering for that, for permits, is it scaled by some size of the area?
Right, it's scaled by the size of the zone.
And one more question, like the zones looked like they were weird shapes, so you were saying there's 59 of those, 10 voted for them, what are those?
Oh, I'm sorry, let me go back to the map. Right, so I said there are 59 community boards. Community boards represent neighborhoods in New York. They're probably larger than what we consider a neighborhood, but a community district, community board 5, for example, would probably be this area here, right? So this rezoning is this community board votes on this rezoning. So this area is not the entire community board. So the rezonings are these colored areas. The community boards cover the entire city, and there are 59 of those.
Gotcha, thanks.
Sorry, and then the unit of observation is in each year, in each one of these areas, you have like the number of permits, the average sale price and the average rent. Is that the way to think about it?
Each area, number of permits.
Yeah.
Sales is a building, this unit is
So you
the actual.
aggregate that up by this geographic area.
No, we just have the record, the sale record. We have a spatial control, we know what district it's in, right? But we're actually looking at the sale price. Same thing with the rental, we have the building, we have the rental income. We know what area it's in, so we have a spatial control for that, but we're actually measuring the attributes of that building.
Just, yeah, one last question on this. It looks like these red zones is it along a commercial corridor or something? My uptown geography is not sharp enough to be able to recognize immediately, but it's not like a blanket entire neighborhood. It's like a very precise little sliver. So I guess part of my question is, if this red zone is a commercial corridor, it's maybe actually quite different from something 2 blocks away, which is more of a quiet street.
They are residential zones, though. They are residential zones. So
I guess my question is a follow-up to this guy's question is like, why are they configured in the way that they are then?
why did they map them that way? The
Yeah.
zones?
It seems like something very specific was being selected for this kind of upzoning.
The areas were chosen because they were seen as places that had the potential to accommodate more housing. So they are, I guess you would say, by New York City standards, medium density zoned districts. But in terms of why the city did not choose, a more less of a weird shape, I'm not sure. That's a good question. right? That's a good question, to be frank. But I do know, they produce a report that describes their process for choosing these neighborhoods for rezoning. They engage with the real estate consultant to help them select the levels of affordability that would work in these areas. But from what I recall in reading the document, they don't spell out why it has this kind of funny shape. But to your point, I guess what you're suggesting is the impacts might be different here as opposed to what you would expect. Well, I want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like you're implying that the impact could be different in the red versus the green area. Is that correct? Yeah. Part of what we're doing is we're comparing the trends though. So even if they are different and they're moving through time, do those trends change when MIH occurs? So that's part of what we're trying to capture. There's also this perception, right? The people in the community, so there's this hypothesis, right? There's the people in the community who are very vociferously arguing that despite this weird shape, this is going to impact their neighborhood, right? So they're putting forth this hypothesis. That's part of what we're testing. Is there anything to the hypothesis? I think the initial reactions, if I was standing up here in 2010, I'd say, well, this is just going to increase housing. This is, why would people be opposed to that? But that's, that's not the way it played out. So part of what we're doing is trying to operationalize their critique and test it. See, is there any validity to it? Other questions? Yes.
Is there data on who these new people are who are moving into these? Is there trends and demographics about income and whatnot? To see if it's being take up is good?
Yeah, yes. And that's something we hope to look at going forward. Yeah. So is there data on people moving into these zones? Yes, there is some data. I was going to talk about this toward the end, but since you asked now, the sense it's not easily accessible from the census data, for example, but there are private data vendors that do have data that's very granular. You can actually identify people, and there's some limited demographic, socioeconomic data that you can tease out from those data sets. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end. Other questions? Is 4 o'clock a hard stop for me? Guess I should hurry up. So yeah, got the results. Generally speaking, sales prices are going up in the MIH destination. They actually seem to be declining. Our results are not that precise though, so can't attach too much weight to them. Same thing with rents as well immediately after the adoption of MIH. But in some, we don't really get statistically significant results. So there is a positive coefficient associated with the variable that would indicate that the trend in permitting increased in the MIH areas after the adoption of MIH, but it's not statistically significant. We don't have any real evidence in terms of changing housing prices either for rents or sales. So could be several things going on, could be, even though sample sizes are not that small, lack of statistical power, could be hypotheses I presented regarding prices, could be a countervailing effect. More likely though, and this is a result of some other evidence, I think it just didn't have that much of an effect. It seems as though the program, although they tried to calibrate it so that developers would not be discouraged from building more housing, wasn't that effective, right? It's also a possibility, it's still relatively new. Program was just adopted in 2016. Our data only goes up to 2020. Might be too soon, and we know we had onset of COVID-19, so it may really take, it's possible, right? You could argue that it'll take several more years for the effect to really kick in. It may be that developers were initially discouraged, but over time, developers can adopt. They can change the development techniques. They can learn about how to marry this with other subsidy programs. And so the effects might change, but so far, we're not really seeing a significant effect. And a number of other observers, based more on anecdotal evidence, are drawing the same conclusion. The program has not had much of an effect. And in fact, the new, I guess he's not that new anymore, Mayor Adams has put forth his own affordable housing initiative, okay? And part of the problem, or part of the challenge, I was speaking about the area median income. This is a map of New York City. These are the 5 boroughs: the Bronx, Manhattan, Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. So the surrounding counties, except for maybe Staten Island, but the surrounding counties generally have higher incomes than the 5 boroughs. And so when the area median income is set, including counties like Westchester, for example, the housing that's classified as affordable is not affordable for many of the people who live in the lowest income neighborhoods, right? This chart shows, for example, the proportion of the New York City population in these different affordability bands and the proportion of housing units that fall, the portion of affordable housing units that fall within each of these categories. So, and it's even worse in some neighborhoods. So in some neighborhoods, maybe 40% of the population is extremely low income, but very few, relatively few of the units that are being built target that population. So something about such, perhaps a somewhat unanticipated challenge, both meeting the needs of extremely low income households, yet not making the program so onerous that developers are deterred from building affordable housing. Okay. So that's sort of the conundrum, if you will, with inclusionary zoning. One of the things, to get to the woman's question in the back, that we're planning to do is to look at changes in migration into moving into these neighborhoods. Another way of discerning what's happening in terms of the dynamics of the neighborhood. For this, we're planning to use data from Infutor, which is a private company that collects addresses for each individual. It's kind of creepy. I looked at my, it had my addresses going back to graduate school. So I was like, okay. But in any event, it does have names and addresses, and their methods are proprietary. So I'm not sure how they infer demographic information, but they do have it. So we're debating how we can use that. But you could get a sense of, for example, where people are moving from. So we could, for example, see if people were moving, say, for example, from the Bronx before the MIH, and then from from Manhattan after MIH, right? So we could see, do the origins of where people are coming from, does that change over time? And we could undertake a similar type of analysis to see before and after MIH. Is there a change in the origins of where people are coming from? Are they coming from higher income neighborhoods, communities of color, et cetera, et cetera? So if we marry the demographic data that Inclusionary provides with information about the origins of the neighborhoods where people are moving from, we might be able to tease out if there's a change in who's moving in. We could also look at people moving out as well. So that's something else we plan to do as well. So just to wrap up, I guess the good news, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily deterring new development. But it's not so clear that it's increasing much development either. Okay, so I guess you could say there's good news and bad news. But the caveats I mentioned, timing of the study, just as the pandemic is getting underway, the impact of COVID-19, a longer panel of data might be more convincing, but with the interruption of the pandemic, it might be difficult to interpret that. Probably would need to wait, at least several more years before drawing really firm conclusions. And I guess I'll take questions now. Yes.
I'm curious why we'd hypothesize that there would be a change in movement from different parts of the city, given there's the IZ didn't seem to affect landlord, developer behavior. Like, is it just a signal that, what's the hypothesis there? So if we know that if the data is right, that if your analysis is right, that developers didn't respond to this, why do we then think that there would be a change in resident behavior?
Well, it's possible that people could be moving and have characteristics that are associated with higher socioeconomic status, even if they're not necessarily higher income, graduate students, or artists. So even if the actual dynamics of the housing prices aren't changing so much, the demographics of who's moving in could change.
Because of I guess I'm asking, but not because of the inclusionary zoning, or you're saying you still think it would be an effect of the inclusionary zoning and not something else?
Well, that's what we're testing. Yeah, that's what we're testing.
Right.
Yeah. So it's another way of trying to test these hypotheses, right? So we looked at sales and prices and permitting. So we're looking at actual people, or do we see a change in the patterns of who's moving in and moving out? But you're right, you probably would be a little, I guess if I had to bet, I probably would bet.
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to think what would be the kind of the logic model there for what you'd expect, why people would be moving if it's not actually having an effect on development.
Right. And, we'll have a little bit more data, although we'll run into this problem with the pandemic, but, we'll have, a few more years of data, so we'll see. But, your point is well taken. Part of this too, we have this input data, we gotta do something. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm just curious if you did any falsification tests or placebo tests, the idea being that you shift the time of treatment. So some of the pre-trends you in some of your charts, the MIH zones were like shooting up pre-treatment. And it could be that developers are just seeing this as a signal of, oh, let's get our foot in the door prior to the gentrification happening or what have you. So just with the placebo test, shifting your treatment to 2 quarters prior to MIH designation or 4 quarters, I'm curious if you'd see an effect that way or not.
We did try the timing of the MIH. As you say, we didn't do a year. We did, I think it was 2 quarters, 2 sales quarters. If we didn't see anything, but we could. Your point is well taken. We could try. I mean, initially we only had the 1 buffer, so we tried 2. Now we have 2 buffers. We're trying that. So yeah, we could try some other outcomes. Although I guess the more different sensitivity tests we try, the less confident I'll be if we do happen to see a result. But, you know, there is that trade-off. It is worth exploring some permutations. And so for example, the tenth of a mile buffer is something that we've tried that, you know, see if we pick up anything like that. But yeah, your point as well, definitely a good point. Yes.
There are two other sources of variation that I thought were kind of interesting, and I wonder if there's a possibility to explore them. One is on the initial map that you showed us of MIH, you had these locations where people had where developers had voluntarily selected to be part of the MIH program. And I wonder, especially because some of your measures are at the parcel level, you're suggesting if you can look at those voluntary selections, or maybe even draw like a buffer around those voluntary selections to see if that had any effect different from being in these mandatory MIH zones. And then the other possible area of variation was you also showed us a table where people could select where developers could select different ways to satisfy the MIH qualifications. And I wondered if your data allowed for you to look at, you know, if you set it at a 30% AMI versus this 80%, if there was a different effect. Obviously, with the sample size, I know that all of that gets.
So the first point you make about also including the developer-led rezoning. So initially that was what we studied. I didn't present that here, and we didn't see an effect. And so we decided to, you know, say, well, let's tease out and focus on the neighborhood level rezonings where you might expect a bigger effect. That's what I presented here. So we did try that. Your second point, we haven't tried that, but I think we could do that. I think we could separate out the different types of subsidies required. I think we could do that. That's something we could consider. Yes.
I guess not a hard statistical question, just curious about the kinds of development, like the kind of housing that's being provided. Like as an experienced renter, I've noticed that like really the affordable stuff is almost always shared housing. So I
When you say
wonder,
shared, you mean
shared, I mean
unit?
roommates, like
Oh.
renting a room in a home
Okay.
instead of renting a whole apartment. And so I wonder if they're building apartments, which is kind of my assumption, that they're going to be missing most of the low income renters in any, just because of the type of housing, or is that your observation or not?
Well, so these are new developments, so and they're multifamily buildings, because remember, they're building at higher density, so it typically would not be like a single family home with a couple of rooms or in the is that what I'm saying?
I mean, like, you know, if you want to rent for less than like $1,000 a month in Chicago, you have to share a room, basically.
Well, these are subsidized units though.
Yeah, well, but I just wonder how they compete with room share type rental.
I would think they would be a lot nicer, right? Because
Well,
these
in
are,
terms of price.
well, I mean, the price. So there are new units that are subsidized. The developer is, in most instances, providing a significant chunk of the subsidy, which they're offsetting by being allowed to build at a higher density. You know, it could be possible that the tenant could have a voucher, for example. In some instances, the developer can also take advantage of other subsidies like the LIHTC program. But I don't know if you remember the chart I had up there, that really depends on the level of affordability the developer is providing. But I don't think the types of units you're describing, and that's also true in New York City, right? If you want an affordable unit, most likely you'll have a roommate. But I think in this scenario, these are going to be mostly families, low and moderate income families who would be moving into these units, or it could be one person if it's a studio or one bedroom.
Yeah.
I don't think you're having several adults, for example, who are moving. That's not my impression, although I haven't studied that systematically, but they have occupancy standards, and you know, the area median income is adjusted for the number of people in the family. And so if you have 4 adults making, $40,000 or $50,000 a year, they probably wouldn't qualify. Because even though individually their incomes are not that high, if they presented themselves as a family, their incomes would probably be too high. So I don't think it's so common that you have, the roommate situation in these affordable housing units. But I haven't studied that systematically, to be honest. Yes.
Just another kind of related specific question, and I may be thinking of various like incentive programs in New York and conflating them, but city does this, presumably the city keeps tabs on who's moving into the subsidized units. So my question is like, you want to use the in future or whatever that.
In future.
I'm sorry, data to track like broader demographic shifts in the neighborhood, but could you obtain administrative data from the city about who are the direct beneficiaries of the newly created subsidized units?
Not as far as I know. I have tried to obtain administrative data from the city of New York in another scenario and was not successful. It may be possible, using a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that maybe I could get the data. Probably wouldn't come in a nice spreadsheet that I just plug in to Stata or something, but I'm not aware of it being available and easily accessible, and certainly not the previous addresses of the people in the data set. So maybe they would have maybe I could get, maybe I could get the previous address, but yeah.
Yeah, it just seems like that's sort of, could be part of adjudicating these debates and this skepticism argument, right?
Yeah. So, but that's a point, that's something to consider. Cities, not only in New York, are making a lot more data available, publicly available. They do have concerns about privacy, so I don't know if the city would be willing to share addresses of people who are living there. We've been trying to get data on addresses for public housing residents, or not current residents, but who live in former Hope 6 developments. So, but if you have any contacts, let me know. You had your hand up too. Well, I don't, but maybe I didn't speak to Chris yet first. So.
I was just gonna ask if you might offer some broader reflections on what you think the implications of these findings are. As you know, there's a lot of interest in inclusionary zoning right now nationally, in part because of a lot of research from economists who are claiming that it's really over-regulation of the housing market, which is restraining supply and contributing to the unaffordability in a lot of places. And so in response to that, the idea is if only we would, upzone or, kind of loosen the zoning, we could increase affordable housing significantly. And it seems like at least in this particular instance that you've studied, that did not happen. So I just wonder if you have thoughts about the broader implications of that, or maybe it's just, this is too idiosyncratic to generalize from.
Yeah, well, I guess my prior bias would be that the signaling hypothesis is kind of misplaced. That would be my prior hypothesis, which I guess I still have now after looking at this data. I think what happened, what people are fearful of is the new development triggering a change in the neighborhood. But I think what's happening is that's the evidence of the change that's already underway. I don't think it's the new building that's triggering it. So I think the problem is more on the calibrating it so that you can so we do get affordable units from the developer, but not so onerous that we deter development. So I still think inclusionary zoning can be part of a successful program. I think in the New York case, it may be too onerous, or like I said, it might just be too soon. It takes, sometimes it takes a while for developers to figure out how to use these programs. When Light Tech was initially adopted in the 1980s, there were a lot of criticisms about the program being overly complex and, it's not going to build any housing because who wants to jump through all these hoops? But over time, developers figured out how to make it work. And so something similar could play out here, might take a few more years, I guess. So I still would tend to look favorably on inclusionary zoning as part of one tool towards the affordable housing crisis, right? So I don't think, although I guess I'm presenting evidence that suggests otherwise. But you know, we believe what we believe, right? You know, but yeah, I'm still somewhat optimistic, I guess, about inclusionary zoning.
Okay, well, so we have a reception to follow outside, so anyone who wanted to continue the conversation is certainly encouraged and welcome to do that. But for the moment, let's thank Lance for a terrific. I think the reception is just kind of right out